Shadow was not the kind of dog that families usually picked first. He was a medium-sized, mixed-breed rescue with deep brown fur, one floppy ear, and eyes that held the softness of 1,000 unspoken stories. But when the Malik family walked into the shelter that rainy afternoon, the universe quietly shifted in his favor. Ahmed, the father, was exhausted from long weeks at work. Maria, the mother, was balancing responsibilities like a tightrope walker. And their two kids, 8-year-old Ayan and 12-year-old Hannah, wandered around the shelter rooms with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty, each silently hoping they would find a dog who felt like home. When they paused in front of Shadow's kennel, he didn't bark or jump like the others. Instead, he simply stood, tail gently wagging, offering them the most patient, hopeful stare. Something about his calmness reached into the small cracks inside each family member, the ones that life had carved without permission. Within minutes, they were filling adoption papers, unaware that this quiet dog would soon become the center of their world in ways none of them expected. The drive home was filled with laughter. Shadow sitting awkwardly between the kids, unsure if he was allowed to lean on them until Ayan gently placed his hand on Shadow's back and whispered, "It's okay. You're with us now," a moment that loosened the invisible knot in Shadow's chest. That first night, he wandered through the hallways, sniffing corners, peeking into bedrooms, memorizing the rhythm of this new life, and finally curled up outside the kids' room, refusing to sleep anywhere else. Days turned into weeks, and Shadow slipped into the family's routines like a missing puzzle piece. Finally found morning cuddles with Hannah before school, waiting by the door for Ayan every afternoon, and keeping Maria company in the kitchen, like a silent sous chef who understood her stress better than anyone. Ahmed, who rarely let his emotions show, found himself talking to Shadow during late-night tea breaks, telling him about deadlines, worries, and the heaviness of providing for a family. And Shadow, in his quiet way, seemed to absorb every word with a loyalty so pure, it softened even Ahmed's tired heart. But just when everything felt perfect, the Malik family received news that shook their home. They would have to move to another city for Ahmed's work. A bigger opportunity, but a stressful transition. Boxers filled the living room. Routines fell apart, and the air became thick with tension as the kids feared leaving their school. Maria panicked about starting over, and Ahmed carried the silent guilt of uprooting everyone. Shadow sensed every bit of the chaos, pacing, whining softly, trying to comfort whoever he found alone. Nudging Hannah's hands when she cried in her room, lying on Ayan's feet when he sat quietly pretending to be brave, resting his head on Maria's lap when she stressed over packing, and placing his paw on Ahmed's knee as if to tell him he wasn't failing his family. But the real turning point came one cold evening, when the power went out during a storm. Darkness filled the house, the wind rattled the windows, and the kids grew frightened. Shadow rushed to them instantly, guiding them with gentle nudges toward the living room where the family gathered around a few candles. For the first time in weeks, without boxes, gadgets, or distractions, they really talked about their fears, their hopes, and how uncertain everything felt. Shadow lay in the center, warm and steady, his presence stitching the family together like an emotional anchor. That night changed something. The family realized they could face any storm, literal or emotional, as long as they stood together. And Shadow seemed to glow with quiet pride, understanding he had fulfilled a purpose bigger than he ever imagined. But destiny had more in store. 2 days before the move, while the family was busy loading the final boxes, Shadow slipped out of the half-open gate following a faint familiar scent. Something from his past life that clawed at his memory, something he couldn't ignore. By the time the Maliks noticed he was gone, it was already late. Panic erupted. The kids cried. Ahmed ran through the streets calling his name. Maria phoned neighbors. And the storm clouds gathered again, as if nature itself sensed the fear gripping the family. Shadow, miles away now, wandered through alleys, his body trembling with confusion as the scent faded, leaving him lost with only the echoes of his past. The abandonment, the fear, the loneliness he thought he had escaped forever. Meanwhile, the Malik family refused to give up. They searched through the night, their hearts heavy with the fear of losing the dog who had stitched their family together. And as dawn approached, something far more dramatic and dangerous was waiting ahead, setting the stage for a rescue that would test the strength of their love like never before. Shadow wandered through the sleeping city with raindrops clinging to his fur like tiny beads of fear, his breaths short, his steps uneven, and his heart torn between the faint scent he followed and the family he desperately wanted to return to. But something deeper, an old memory, a shadow of abandonment kept tugging him forward until he reached an empty construction site at the edge of town where the scent abruptly vanished, leaving him standing alone in the growing storm, trembling not from cold, but from the sudden realization that he was lost again. Meanwhile, miles away, the Malik family was spiraling into panic. Ayan's voice cracked as he called Shadow's name between sobs. Hannah tried to be brave, but her hands shook violently. Maria blamed herself for not checking the gate, and Ahmed drove the car slowly through dark flooded streets, headlights cutting through sheets of rain as he searched every corner, every alley, haunted by the image of Shadow wandering alone. Hours passed with no sign, and when the first light of dawn crept across the sky, Their exhaustion turned into a painful silence, the kind that comes when fear becomes too large for words. Maria gathered the kids in her arms, whispering that they wouldn't stop searching. And even Ahmed, who always tried to be strong, felt tears burn at the corners of his eyes, realizing how deeply this dog had wrapped himself into their hearts. Back at the construction site, Shadow curled beneath a metal beam to shield himself from the rain, but sleep wouldn't come. Flashes of his past life played behind his eyes, the family that abandoned him, the long nights of hunger, the fear of every passing car, and the panic returned, tightening around his chest until he whined softly, wishing more than anything to hear Ion's laugh or feel Hannah's gentle hands. As the sun fully rose, he forced himself up, limping slightly from the cold and the long night, and began wandering again, but he didn't know he was walking toward danger. A deep ravine had formed near the construction site from old soil erosion, hidden under thick weeds, and as Shadow stepped closer, sniffing for any familiar trace, the ground gave way beneath him. Rocks crumbled, dirt slid, and he tumbled downward with a terrified yelp that echoed across the empty field. The fall wasn't deadly, but his back leg twisted painfully, trapping him between loose stones and tangled roots. He cried out again, louder this time, the sound sharp and full of desperation, and by some miracle, a delivery driver passing nearby heard the faint echo and called emergency rescue services, reporting that he thought a dog had fallen somewhere in the construction zone. At the Malik house, the phone rang like a spark of hope in the darkness. Ahmed answered, and his breath caught when he heard the driver describe a brown dog with one floppy ear. Within minutes, the family was in the car again, racing toward the site with a mix of fear and unstoppable determination. As they arrived, rescue workers were already lowering themselves carefully into the ravine with ropes, trying to reach the wounded dog who was shaking violently from pain and fear. Ion screamed Shadow's name so loudly it startled the workers, and Shadow's ears perked just slightly, his eyes widening with recognition as he heard the voice he had longed for all night. He tried to bark, but the sound came out weak and cracked. Still, it was enough. Hannah burst into tears. Maria fell to her knees, praying under her breath, and Ahmed placed his arm around his family, though his own hands trembled uncontrollably. One of the rescuers reached Shadow, speaking softly to calm him, gently freeing his leg and securing him in a harness. The ascent was slow, painfully slow, every second stretching into an eternity as the Malik family held their breath, watching the rope creak and sway as Shadow was pulled upward, his body limp, but his eyes locked desperately on his family. The moment he reached the top, Ion ran before anyone could stop him, wrapping his arms around Shadow's neck, sobbing into his wet fur as Shadow licked his face weakly, whimpering like a child returning home after a nightmare. Hannah knelt beside them, stroking his head, whispering, "We're here, we're here," while Maria held both kids and cried openly, her tears mixing with the rain. Ahmed, overwhelmed, knelt beside his dog, their dog, and pressed his forehead gently against Shadow's, whispering, "You're part of this family. We're never losing you again." Paramedics checked Shadow, confirming that, although his leg was sprained and swollen, he would recover with rest and care. The drive home was quieter than usual. Ion kept one hand on Shadow the whole way. Hannah draped her sweater over him for warmth, and Maria kept turning around from the front seat to make sure he was breathing comfortably. Ahmed drove slowly, every once in a while glancing through the rearview mirror with a look that held both relief and guilt. When they finally reached home, the kids made a soft bed for Shadow near the living room sofa, where he could rest without moving too much. The family sat with him for hours, talking, crying, laughing softly, recognizing how close they had come to losing him and how deeply he had become the thread holding them all together. But little did they know that while Shadow would heal, the move to the new city would bring a challenge far greater than anyone expected, a moment that would test Shadow's courage, devotion, and instincts in ways the Maliks could never imagine, setting the stage for the most dramatic chapter of their story yet. Shadow healed slowly but steadily over the next few weeks, and though the Malik family delayed their move for his recovery, the day eventually came when the boxers were taped shut once again. The rooms echoed with emptiness, and the family's nerves returned, but this time, the fear was different, lighter somehow, as if they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, strengthened by the bond forged during those stormy nights. The new city was loud, crowded, and unfamiliar. Tall buildings replaced the quiet streets they were used to, and the apartment they moved into sat on the fourth floor of a large, bustling complex where people hurried like they were always late, horns blared, and every sound felt sharper. Shadow, still limping slightly but eager to adapt, followed the family through the hallways with cautious curiosity, sniffing the new scents, listening to the vibrations of footsteps, trying to map this strange place into something that felt safe. At first, the kids struggled. Hannah missed her old friend Zion, didn't like the noise, and Maria found the change overwhelming, while Ahmed threw himself into his new job, hoping desperately that his decision to move would eventually prove right. Through all this, Shadow became the quiet glue that kept the family from falling apart. On the kids' first day of school, he waited by the door for hours, pacing nervously until they returned. In the evenings, he rested his head on Maria's lap while she prayed for peace. At night, he sat beside Ahmed on the balcony as the city lights blinked like restless stars and listened to him speak softly about his worries. But change, especially big change, always brings moments of danger, and Shadow's greatest test arrived on a Friday evening, just 2 months after the move. The apartment complex held a small courtyard where children played after school, and though Shadow still had to be careful with his recovering leg, he often joined Ion and Hannah there, staying close and alert. That day, the courtyard was filled with laughter until a sudden scream tore through the air. A small boy, no older than 5, had kicked his ball too hard and it rolled straight toward the open gate leading to the busy main road. The boy darted after it without thinking, and in the same instant, a speeding delivery van turned the corner, heading directly toward the child. Time seemed to slow. Adults froze, voices rose, and Hannah dropped the book she was holding. Ion gasped and stumbled forward, but he was too far away. Shadow, however, reacted with impossible speed, instinct taking over long before thought, and launched himself across the courtyard, ignoring the pain in his leg as he sprinted toward the child. Just as the boy stepped onto the asphalt, Shadow slammed into him with enough force to knock him back onto the sidewalk, sending the ball rolling into the street where the van crushed it in an instant. Horns blared, brakes screeched, and people screamed, but Shadow didn't stop. He grabbed the boy's jacket gently with his teeth and dragged him fully out of danger, his paws scraping the pavement, his body shaking violently from the impact and strain. The courtyard erupted. Parents rushed forward. The van driver stumbled out in shock, and everyone gathered around the trembling dog who had thrown himself into harm's way without hesitation. The rescued boy burst into tears and clung to Shadow's neck, as if clinging to life itself, while Hannah and Ion ran toward them, crying and laughing at the same time. Maria came rushing from the building, her heart pounding so loudly she thought she might faint, and Ahmed followed moments later, breathless and stunned. When they saw Shadow lying there, chest heaving, leg trembling from the strain, they realized they were reliving the fear of losing him all over again. But this time, something was different. Shadow wasn't the one being saved. He was the savior. A doctor from the building, who had witnessed everything, checked Shadow carefully and confirmed that he hadn't injured his leg, only strained it again, and that with rest he would be fine. The family collapsed around him in relief, their tears mixing with the gratitude of dozens of neighbors who stared at the dog with awe. Overnight, Shadow became a hero in the apartment complex. People brought him treats, children drew pictures of him as a superhero, elders patted him on the head and prayed blessings over him, and even the building manager placed a shiny plaque near the courtyard that read, "Shadow, the dog who saved a life." But for the Malik family, the true importance of his bravery was far more personal. It reminded them that love, loyalty, and courage weren't bound by species or words. They lived in actions, in sacrifices, in the silent devotion of a dog who had once been abandoned but now stood at the center of their world. As weeks passed, the new city slowly stopped feeling strange. Friendships formed, routines settled, and laughter became common again in the Malik home. One quiet night, as the family sat together on the balcony, watching the lights flicker across the skyline, Shadow rested peacefully at their feet, his tail thumping softly against the floor. Ahmed looked at his family, at Maria's calm smile, Hannah's gentle laughter, Ion's bright eyes, and whispered, "We're finally home." Shadow lifted his head, glancing at each of them with the warmth of someone who understood far more than he could ever say. And as he laid his head back down, safe and content, the Malik family realized a truth that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They had adopted Shadow, but in the end, it was Shadow who had saved them all, teaching them what it truly meant to be a family.